They called him over without looking, handed him a mop, and pointed at a spill. Then laughed when he said he was there to interview. A black man in a suit, resume in hand, standing in the marble lobby of a tech empire, mistaken for the janitor, before he even opened his mouth. They smirked, one of them whispering a nickname he'd never forget, turning his name into a joke passed around the office like stale coffee. He stood there silent, swallowing dignity like glass, while polished shoes stepped around him, never once seeing him as anything more than background. But what they didn't know, what none of them saw, was that the man they mocked was the one who'd buried the first crack in their empire, and the fall was already in motion. This isn't just a story about racism in the workplace. It's about how arrogance blinds power, how injustice invites reckoning, and how one man burned every lie they built without raising his voice. If that moment gripped you, drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, hit that like, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story, it's only getting started. Chamberlain Knox sat high above the city, his office perched on the 20th floor of the Sterling Glass Tower, a monument to power and precision. The walls were draped in minimalist art, the glass desk gleamed with surgical cleanliness, and every item in the room whispered affluence. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Men like Chamberlain ran companies not by leading, but by dominating, cutting down with cold smiles and passive slights. On this particular Thursday morning, he leafed through a small stack of printed resumes. Paper was outdated, but Chamberlain insisted. He liked the feel of power between his fingers, the tangible ability to approve or eliminate someone's future with a simple flick of his wrist. He sipped his espresso and picked up the next resume. The paper was heavier, almost elegant, ivory parchment, subtly embossed gold trim, a rare crest of an Ivy League seal at the header. Chamberlain read the name slowly, dragging it across his tongue like something foreign. Jarius Rohn. He tilted his head slightly. The credentials were exceptional. Degrees in information security and systems architecture from prestigious universities. A decade of service in naval cybersecurity with honors. Multiple patents listed under his name. None of it mattered. Chamberlain's lip curled. Ivory paper, he murmured, voice thick with disdain. Gold foil. Who the hell does he think he is? He didn't ask anyone in particular, but his assistant Bethany stood to his left, notepad in hand, already used to these rhetorical eruptions. Chamberlain shook his head, folded the resume twice, then slid it under his espresso cup, smearing the parchment with a faint brown ring. We're not running a luxury branding agency. This isn't a poetry contest. He's trying too hard. Bethany opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. She'd learned. It wasn't worth it. Chamberlain leaned back and gestured toward the door. Call in the next one, he said, dismissing the moment as if it had never existed. Outside the door, Jarius Rohn stood in the polished lobby of the executive floor, eyes calmly tracking the minute hand on the vintage brass clock. He'd arrived 20 minutes early. That was the rule he lived by. He wore a deep navy suit, pressed with care, and a silver tie bar shaped like a shield. Subtle nod to his years in the Navy. His shoes were immaculate, not flashy, but clean and dignified. Appearance mattered, not to impress, but to shield. He knew exactly what assumptions followed men like him into spaces like this. He checked his phone once more. No new messages. No alerts. Just the interview confirmation from a week ago. A digital signature at the bottom from Bethany Crane. Upstairs, Chamberlain was now speaking to a group of interns brought in for orientation. He paced slowly in front of the projector screen, offering a lecture on corporate agility. But in his hand, held casually like a prop, was Jarius' resume, now wrinkled and coffee-stained. He waved it like a cautionary tale. You want to know how not to introduce yourself? He asked, holding up the paper. This guy sent his CV printed on boutique stock gold seals, like he's a Nobel laureate. Look at this name, Jarius Rohn. He said it again, dragging the syllables, changing the rhythm, exaggerating it with a mock accent, then laughing. The room chuckled uneasily at first, then with more certainty once they saw he was serious. Chamberlain smiled, clearly pleased with his own showmanship. I looked at this and thought, what is this? a resume, or a wedding invitation. If he shows up with white gloves and a bow tie, we'll put him on event staff. Someone go down and see if he brought silverware. More laughter. He folded the resume once more and dropped it on the table like garbage. Let's move on. Next case. 15 minutes passed. Jarius waited. The receptionist, a young woman named Rain, finally approached. She didn't meet his gaze. Her voice was trained to be even. Mr. Rohn, I'm afraid your meeting has been postponed. There was an error in scheduling. Jarius didn't flinch. Is there a time to reschedule? He asked, voice calm, balanced. Rain hesitated, looking at the screen for longer than necessary. Unfortunately, no future appointments are showing at the moment. I'm sorry. He nodded. Once. It was an old rhythm. Smooth the sting, maintain dignity, step back in silence. As he left, the polished marble floor beneath him gleamed in the overhead lights. He passed a cluster of junior associates exiting the elevator, laughing too loudly. One of them said a name, something close to his, but twisted, shortened. Something crude. Another repeated it, as if it were a joke they'd all been told. He walked past without reaction. He'd learned to leave his anger in his chest, tight and buried. By the time Jarius stepped outside, the overcast sky cast gray shadows across the plaza. He stood still for a moment, adjusting his coat collar against the wind. His phone buzzed. A message from his mentor, a retired admiral who had once told him that excellence wasn't armor, it was bait. How did it go? It read. Jarius looked at the screen, then locked the phone without answering. There was nothing to say. Somewhere above him, Chamberlain was shaking hands with another candidate, a friend's son, underqualified but familiar. They laughed about golf, family estates, and the importance of culture fit. As they toasted with scotch, Chamberlain's espresso cup still rested on the folded parchment that had once carried Jarius' life's work. He didn't remember the name anymore. It had served its purpose as a punchline. That night in his apartment, Jarius sat at his kitchen counter, staring at his laptop screen. The auto-rejection email had arrived. Thank you for your interest. He had read it 3 times. The cursor blinked in the reply window, but he didn't type. There was no point. He opened the resume file, scanned the words, the accomplishments. Despite the memory that gnawed at the edge of his composure, he stood tall, the collar of his coat sharp, shoes shined, chin level. There had been no follow-up email, no call, no apology, just silence. But a new message had appeared in his inbox the day before, automated but official, stating that his interview had been rescheduled due to a calendar glitch. A new time, a new room, a second chance, or so it seemed. The receptionist this time was someone different, younger, barely out of college, with a stiff smile and fingers that hovered nervously above her keyboard. Jarius gave his name calmly, voice steady, expression unreadable. She tapped something into the system, hesitated, then looked up with a careful glance toward the glass-walled offices behind her. Yes, Mr. Rohn, she said, words clipped. There's been another scheduling conflict. The room originally booked has been reassigned. She paused, eyes flicking toward an office door that hadn't opened, but behind which Chamberlain Knox's silhouette moved deliberately, pacing with exaggerated slowness. But if you wouldn't mind, she continued, we can have you wait just down that corridor for a moment while we sort out the room. Her hand gestured not toward the open lobby or seating lounge, but to the side, a narrow hallway veering left, where the marble faded into industrial tile and overhead lighting buzzed faintly. It won't be long, she added quickly, already turning her eyes back to the monitor. Jarius followed her direction without a word. He walked past the reception desk, past the tastefully arranged sculpture garden, and turned the corner where luxury ended abruptly. The hallway led toward the back of the floor, where it narrowed and darkened slightly, ending at a locked service door and a freight elevator used for equipment and vendor deliveries. The bench against the wall was a cold metal slab, paint chipped at the corners. No one else was around. The hum of overhead lights filled the silence. Jarius glanced at his watch. 10 minutes past his scheduled time. Then 20. Still he waited. Executives walked past the corridor, some glancing in curiously, others not at all. One man, gray-haired and dressed in a navy pinstripe suit, slowed his pace as he passed, looking at Jarius as though trying to decide whether to ask for directions or question why someone who didn't wear a maintenance badge was near the loading zone. He said nothing and moved on. Another group of employees, carrying portfolios and latte cups passed, murmuring among themselves. One of them made a half smile and a polite nod, the kind you gave someone waiting for a ride or holding a clipboard near a supply closet. Jarius said nothing. His back was straight. His hands rested calmly on his knees. But the silence was heavy, and the clock kept ticking. By the 90-minute mark, the only visitor was a custodian pushing a mop cart. She slowed when she saw him. "You waiting for someone?" she asked gently. Her voice had an accent, Old Bronx mixed with something else. Jarius gave a brief nod. "They told me to wait here." The custodian frowned slightly. "This ain't where they usually do interviews." He smiled just barely. "So I've noticed." She gave him a long look, nodded, and kept moving. He returned his eyes to the blank hallway, to the elevator that had not moved, to the heavy silence pressing in around him. 2 hours after he'd first stepped into the building, footsteps returned. Not hurried, not apologetic, just functional. The receptionist appeared at the end of the corridor, hands clasped together, expression stiff. She stopped a few feet away, her words rehearsed. "Mr. Rohn, thank you for your patience. Unfortunately, there's been an error in our internal scheduling system. It appears the interview was logged incorrectly, and the role has since been filled." Jarius looked at her, eyes steady. "So there's no interview," he said quietly. She gave a practiced, almost mechanical nod. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." No one had come to speak with him directly. No manager, no department head, not even Bethany. Only this junior receptionist, sent like a pawn to deliver a final blow. He stood slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate. There was no argument, no confrontation, only silence. He nodded once, the way someone might nod at the end of a funeral. "Of course," he said, voice nearly lost beneath the hum of the lights. She stepped aside as he walked past her. No one else looked his way. He exited the building into a harsh midday sun that reflected off the tower's mirrored windows, casting long lines across the sidewalk. A mother holding a child's hand passed him. A man selling magazines called out. The city went on, oblivious to the quiet erasure that had just occurred behind Sterling Glass's pristine facade. Jarius walked 2 blocks before stopping at a coffee shop tucked beneath an old bookstore. He ordered black coffee, took it to the farthest corner of the room, and stared out the window at nothing in particular. The bitterness grounded him, the heat anchoring him to the moment. He thought about the time, 2 hours lost, not just in waiting, but in dignity. He thought about the way no one had spoken to him directly, how even rejection had been outsourced, mechanized, made sterile. He pulled out his phone, stared at the calendar entry still glowing on the screen. The title said Interview with Sterling Glass, Director of Cybersecurity. It was still there, still blinking like it mattered. He deleted it. Across the city, Chamberlain stood in a penthouse meeting room with members of the executive board. He laughed over lunch, poking fun at the inefficiencies of the digital scheduling system. "Still working out the bugs," he said, grinning. Bethany sat 3 chairs down, lips tight, eyes fixed on her notes. She had seen Jarius' name disappear from the system that morning. She had asked about it. Chamberlain had waved her off. "Not our culture," he had said. Each night he'd sit at his desk reviewing potential roles, tailoring cover letters, reworking details in his CV to present his credentials in a way that wouldn't appear too ambitious, but wouldn't risk being dismissed as ordinary either. He knew the tightrope, knew it well. But no matter how careful he was, the silence from Sterling Glass lingered like a storm cloud refusing to rain. Then, on a Wednesday evening, while organizing his inbox, he came across a file folder that reminded him of a moment he wished to salvage. Before the interview, he had prepared a small, high-quality gift basket, artisan coffee blends, a handwritten note, and a vintage brass pen engraved with a simple inscription. "Thank you for your time and consideration." It was a gesture of professionalism, something he'd done after high-level meetings during his time in federal service. The package had been sent to Bethany Crane's office at Sterling Glass. He'd received no response, but then again, he hadn't expected one. Still, in the back of his mind, he had hoped it might have reached someone willing to remember his name with decency. 3 days later, the package came back. Same wrapping, same ribbon. The courier dropped it off with a simple shrug. Jarius opened it slowly, his hand steady but cold. The contents were untouched. Everything was still in place, perfectly arranged, except for one addition. A sticky note had been slapped onto the front of the envelope, written in rushed handwriting. 2 words, wrong floor. That was all. No signature, no explanation, no attempt at decorum. Just that. He stared at the note for a long time. It could have come from anyone, reception, facilities, or someone else passing through who had been told to return it without question. But the words weren't logistical. They were symbolic. A message. Not that the basket had been misdelivered, but that Jarius himself had no place on that floor. No place in that building. No place in their world. Meanwhile, inside the upper floors of Sterling Glass Tower, the air was filled with plans and excess. The company was preparing its annual autumn masquerade, a tradition Chamberlain Knox held with obsessive pride. The event was opulent, hosted at a private estate on the edge of the city, where stone lions guarded wrought iron gates, and the staff wore gloves even in summer. The masquerade was not just a party, it was a performance. Attire was extravagant, masks custom-made. Each executive received a hand-delivered invitation, and costume designers were hired weeks in advance to ensure perfection. Chamberlain took these things seriously. They were symbols of power, moments to declare superiority without apology. During a prep meeting held 3 days before the event, he walked into the executive suite where junior staff were assembling packages and said, in his usual offhand way, "You know, if that one guy from last week had actually made it through screening, I wonder what he'd have shown up wearing." The room looked up, unsure whether to laugh yet. Chamberlain gave a theatrical pause, then followed up. Probably something with a mop handle, or one of those little shine boxes. Black and brass. Vintage flair, right? A few chuckles followed, mostly from those too new or too spineless to resist. Bethany Crane kept her eyes on her folder. Someone at the back of the room cleared their throat and quickly looked away. Chamberlain smirked, then leaned over to pick up a fabric swatch meant for someone else's costume. People don't get it. It's not about credentials. It's about knowing your place. He said it casually, like talking about weather, then moved on to the next topic, leaving the room colder than he'd found it. On the night of the masquerade, the estate glowed with warm lights strung across sculpted trees. Valet drivers moved like chess pieces, and classical music spilled through every doorway. Inside, guests wandered beneath crystal chandeliers, masks adorned with feathers, gold, and jewels. Chamberlain arrived in a tailored black tuxedo, his mask shaped like a hawk, beak sharp, eyes narrow. Every detail had been tailored to perfection. As he mingled among senior investors and CEOs, he recounted stories of decisive deals and the latest acquisition rumors, dropping names with the ease of someone who'd never had to earn access to any of them. Near the open bar, he retold the story of the Résumé on gold trim paper, laughing harder this time, adding embellishments about scented envelopes and military medals bought off eBay. No one questioned the story. No one mentioned Jarius' name. In that world, he had never existed. He had been erased before he had even arrived. Back in the city, Jarius sat at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, reviewing a data breach case study for a pro bono project. He had spent the day volunteering to audit a nonprofit security infrastructure, work far beneath his skill level, but necessary. The thank you email he received that night was short but genuine, signed by someone who had been shocked that a man of his experience would offer help without compensation. The message made him smile for a second. Just 1 second. He stared at the unopened basket on the kitchen counter. The sticky note still sat on top. Wrong floor. He hadn't thrown it away. That night, he opened a journal he rarely used and began writing, not a complaint, not a rant, but something closer to a field log. He documented the details, dates, times, names. A professional ledger of humiliations. Not because he expected justice, but because he needed the truth to live somewhere beyond memory. He described the service hallway, the fake scheduling, the tone of the receptionist's voice, the metallic clang of the freight elevator behind him. He wrote about the sticky note, how its glue peeled slightly at the edges from the ride back. Jarius Rohn was not there. He hadn't stepped into the building since the returned gift basket arrived on his doorstep, untouched except for the crude note meant to reduce him to a mistake, a misplaced package. But even in his absence, his name hadn't vanished entirely. It floated through the air in muffled jokes and quiet exchanges, never fully mentioned, never openly addressed, but present in the way people paused during conversations when someone referenced interview mistakes or asked about image expectations. What should have faded instead grew sharper in whispers. Across the hall from the executive wing, the HR department welcomed a new round of candidates for mid-level positions. Among them was Raymond Darnell, a sharply dressed professional with a background in talent acquisition and a penchant for details. As he moved through the building during his onboarding, he picked up the usual office chatter. Where to eat, which elevators moved fastest, who to avoid. But something else caught his attention that first afternoon. In the break room, two employees were chuckling over a story that ended with a line. And then he waited by the freight elevator like he belonged there, dressed like he was about to open a car door or pour wine at a banquet. The phrase lingered in Raymond's ears. He tilted his head slightly, looked over at them, and asked, "Who are you talking about?" One of the employees waved a hand and smirked. "Oh, just some guy who came in a while back for an interview. Came looking like a butler from a noir film. Lasted all of 10 minutes before someone told him to wait in the back. Guess he got the message." The laughter resumed. Raymond didn't laugh. He filed the comment away and continued his orientation. Later that day, he stopped by the HR manager's office, a middle-aged woman named Lucinda Park who had been with Sterling Glass since its early startup days. They exchanged pleasantries before Raymond asked, "Did you ever have a candidate named Jarius Rohn? I heard something strange in the break room." Lucinda's expression froze for half a second before recovering. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Rohn? Yes, I remember the name. There was some confusion with his appointment. I think the room was double booked. One of those system errors." Raymond nodded slowly. People seemed to find it funny. Lucinda raised her brows. It was unfortunate, but not malicious. These things happen. Then she glanced at her computer, signaling the conversation was over. What Lucinda didn't say, what she wouldn't say, was that she had been aware of the scheduling switch and had been instructed not to intervene. The directive hadn't come in writing. It never did. But when Chamberlain Knox made suggestions, they weren't meant to be questioned, especially not about image. Days after Jarius' second visit, Chamberlain had called a private meeting with the internal branding consultant. The topic was simple: aesthetic consistency. He didn't use terms like cultural erasure or implicit bias. He didn't have to. Instead, he spoke about presence and presentation, about optics and market expectations. "We need to be aligned across departments," he said. "That includes visual identity. I want guidelines on attire, not formal policies, just directional suggestions." The stylist nodded, taking notes. "Are we talking about cut, color, or texture?" Chamberlain smirked. "All of it. Anything that clashes with our core image. High finance chic. We don't want loud patterns, oversized accessories, or too much individuality. Let's keep it tight, neutral, clean." The stylist understood. It was code. Not an attack on one culture, but a slow erasure of many. Over the next week, an internal memo was circulated titled Visual Standards and Brand Cohesion. It outlined wardrobe inspirations drawn from tech moguls and hedge fund managers. The photo examples featured slim-fit navy suits, taupe blazers, crisp white dress shirts, and minimal ties. There were no braids, no earth tones, no cultural textiles, no expression beyond grayscale corporate conformity. Officially, the memo wasn't mandatory. Unofficially, compliance was expected. Jarius, unaware of the memo, continued with his quiet work. The forensic audit consulting role had grown from a side contract into something more stable. The nonprofit he assisted introduced him to another client, who introduced him to a third. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was clean, honest. He liked that. Still, now and then, a wave of memory returned. The freight hallway, the sticky note, the laughter. It didn't haunt him. It simmered. Some nights, he would walk to the edge of his balcony, notebook in hand, and write more of his record. He included details like how the receptionist hadn't met his eyes the second time, how the hallway's tiles were uneven, how the elevator clicked twice but never opened. He wrote about the janitor who'd asked if he was lost. And now, he wrote about the returned gift basket and the note with its sticky corners curling slightly from the boxes right across the city. Back at Sterling Glass, Chamberlain continued to operate with impunity. In a quarterly review with his team, he again referenced the butler candidate when discussing hiring strategies. "Let's make sure we don't spend time on misalignments," he said. No one asked what he meant. No one had to. Bethany Crane was in the room, typing the minutes with mechanical efficiency. She never looked up, but the note she wrote on her own pad read, "There's rot in the walls." Raymond Darnell, still new, began observing more carefully. He noticed how applicants who looked a certain way were given coffee and ushered into sunlit offices, while others were told to wait in neutral spaces without follow-up. He saw how referrals from certain universities or neighborhoods were fast-tracked, while others were pushed into administrative purgatory. One afternoon, he asked Lucinda quietly if there was an official protocol for visual presentation during interviews. Lucinda's answer was polished. "No formal code. We believe in authenticity, but we do advise candidates to understand the market tone." Raymond smiled politely. Inside, he took a mental photograph of the hypocrisy. "We are honored to invite you to participate as a guest panelist at the Sterling Glass Minority Tech Leadership Forum." The name alone twisted something in his chest. He let the paper rest on the desk for a moment, the logo glinting faintly in the light. He recognized the wording. It was safe, sanitized, and strategic. A polished attempt at redemption. It likely had no idea he had been there before, twice discarded, once mocked, once erased. Yet here they were, extending a hand, likely to fulfill a quota or satisfy an optics report. He considered ignoring it. He considered responding with polite refusal. But then he considered something else. He had built a record of every humiliation, every slight, every moment they believed would disappear in silence. Maybe it was time to see what would happen if he walked into that building not as a hopeful, but as a witness. On the day of the event, Jarius dressed in quiet defiance. He wore a tailored black suit, no flashy accessories, just sharp lines and clean edges. His lapel carried a subtle silver pin, a shield marked with the insignia of his former naval unit. It wasn't decoration. It was a declaration. He arrived early like always. The lobby was already buzzing, with staff setting up signage and catering tables. A woman at the check-in desk looked up as he approached, brows raised, expression neutral. He introduced himself calmly. "Jarius Roan. I'm listed as a panelist." She hesitated. "One moment," she said, flipping through a printed list. She frowned. "I don't see your name on the speaker sheet." He opened the email on his phone and held it out. She skimmed it and nodded slowly. "Oh, maybe you're one of the assistants." Before he could reply, a man carrying a tray of water pitchers walked by and said, "Great, we've been waiting on someone to help at the buffet. There's a spill near the dessert table. Can you handle that before guests arrive?" The clipboard was placed into his hands before he had the chance to speak. In that moment, he stood frozen, not out of confusion, but calculation. The choice to correct them immediately, to assert who he was and what he had come for, tugged at him like instinct. But instead he looked down at the clipboard, his name written nowhere, the boxes unchecked, the schedule incomplete. He walked slowly toward the buffet area, eyes scanning the room. A small puddle of spilled lemonade shimmered on the tile beneath the fruit platter. He took a nearby napkin and bent down to clean it. Around him, staff moved with urgency, ignoring him, assuming him part of the background. He stayed crouched longer than necessary. A photographer passed behind him, snapping images of executives mingling beneath the banner that read, "Empowering the Future." He didn't look up. When he returned to the check-in desk, the woman was gone. Another man stood there now, headset clipped to his collar. "Are you Roan?" he asked, eyes glancing at the email Jarius held out. "We just found your name. You're not listed under speakers, but we have a reserved seat for you. Come this way." He led Jarius down a narrow corridor to a side entrance of the conference room. Inside, the space was arranged in concentric arcs, each row of chairs facing a raised stage with 5 armchairs set beneath lights. The front row was already full executives, donors, brand reps. The man gestured to the back. "We have a seat for you here." Jarius looked at the chair, unmarked, generic, no name tag, no folder, no itinerary. He sat. No one came to ask him to move. No one came to welcome him. On stage, the panel began without him. 5 voices spoke about representation in tech. None of them looked like him. One of the panelists, a woman named Camille Dorsey, known for her work in AI ethics, paused mid-sentence and looked across the room. Her gaze landed on Jarius and narrowed slightly. She finished her answer, then leaned into the moderator's ear. A moment passed. The moderator adjusted the microphone. "We'd like to acknowledge someone special in the audience, Mr. Jarius Roan, former naval cybersecurity lead and one of the top forensic specialists in the private sector today. Welcome, Mr. Roan." Heads turned. A few people clapped politely. Jarius nodded once. The attention lasted 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then the discussion moved on, as if his presence had been an afterthought. As if acknowledgement could replace invitation. When the event ended, guests mingled with panelists near the refreshment tables. Jarius remained seated for several minutes, letting the room empty slowly. He saw Camille approach, but didn't rise. She greeted him quietly, with a look that said more than her words. "They didn't know," she said. "They didn't look." He nodded. "They never do." She touched his shoulder briefly, then moved on. He stood eventually, walking past the buffet where the lemonade had long dried, past the photo wall where interns took turns posing with branded placards. No one stopped him. No one asked for comment. Outside, the sky was soft with evening light, and the air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves and city exhaust. He walked 3 blocks before sitting on a bench near the Riverwalk, watching the current move slowly beneath the steel bridge. He pulled out his notebook. The entry was long. Inside sterling glass, Chamberlain reviewed the event summary with his PR team. "Great turnout," he said. "Got photos?" The marketing lead nodded. "We're featuring Camille in the newsletter. She was electric." Chamberlain clicked through the images on a tablet. "Let's make sure we highlight our commitment to diversity. It matters right now." He didn't ask who else attended. He didn't know Jarius had been there. If he had seen him, he might not have recognized him. To Chamberlain, Jarius Roan was still the man with gold foil paper, the imagined butler who had once dared to apply. Nothing had changed, but things were changing. Quietly, slowly. Raymond Darnell had attended the event too. He had seen the seating chart. He had watched the confusion at the door. He had noted that Jarius' name wasn't on the final roster, even though the invite came from the executive wing. That night, Raymond wrote his own entry. Not in a notebook, but in a report. It was titled Internal Misalignments, Representation Discrepancies in Sterling Glass Community Outreach. He submitted it to the Chief Operations Office under standard review procedures. He didn't expect immediate fallout, but he knew documentation was the first step toward dismantling a lie. Internally, however, whispers circulated about the unlisted guest seated in the back row, the former military expert who was never introduced on stage. No one spoke of the mistake aloud, but a quiet discomfort lingered, most acutely among those who had witnessed the misstep firsthand and chose silence over confrontation. Down in the 3rd floor analysis wing, a junior data compliance analyst named Troy Ellison arrived early to prep for an internal audit. Troy was meticulous, a graduate of a 2nd-tier school, but someone who had earned his place through diligence and precision. He respected order, respected protocol, and above all, believed in process. That morning, while inspecting conference room 2, he noticed that one of the support tables wobbled slightly when pressure was applied. Crouching down to check the base, he discovered the source, a folded sheet of paper jammed under the leg, clearly placed there to level the table. He pulled it free, intending to throw it away, but something about the thickness of the page stopped him. It wasn't scrap paper. It was heavier, high-quality parchment. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. At the top, a name stood in bold serif font, Jarius Rohn. Troy stared at it in disbelief. His heart beat faster as he read the qualifications, the education, the accolades. The ink was slightly smudged from the weight to the table, but the message was clear. Someone had used this man's resume, his record, his history, his effort, as furniture scrap. He stood there for a long moment, then placed the paper gently into his folder and took the elevator to HR. He requested to speak to Lucinda Park directly. She met him in the file room, her usual poise intact, clipboard in hand. Troy held out the resume. "I found this under a table leg in conference room 2, he said quietly. Lucinda's eyes narrowed. She took the paper, examined it, then exhaled slowly. "We'll handle it," she said. "Where did you say you found it?" He repeated the details. She nodded and slipped the document into a manila folder marked internal. Troy hesitated. "This isn't right," he said. Lucinda looked at him calmly. "I know, but escalating this isn't the move. You're new here. Take my advice. Let it go." Her voice carried weight. Not menace, but resignation. She walked out without another word. Later that day, behind her closed office door, Lucinda fed the resume into the secure shredder herself. The motor hummed as the parchment disappeared into strips. She watched it vanish. Not because she hated Jarius Rohn, not because she approved of what had been done, but because she had survived long enough in this company to know what battles ended careers. Her action wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. Upstairs, Chamberlain Knox stood in his office, with one foot resting casually on the edge of his desk. He sipped a neat pour of rye and laughed as he spoke with board member Franklin Shea, an oil magnate with a fondness for cruel banter. The two discussed hiring strategies, diversity optics, and the balance of risk versus return when letting certain applicants through the pipeline. "You know what I think?" Chamberlain said, swirling his glass. "That guy, what's his name again? Rohn? He'll apply again. Give it 3 months. Some people just can't read the signs." Franklin laughed. "What do you want to bet?" Chamberlain smirked. "If he applies again, I'll have him interview in the mailroom, and I'll ask him to bring his own gloves." The laughter echoed through the steel and glass walls, bounced against the awards and plaques hanging from polished fixtures. The kind of sound that lived in private corners and never made it into minutes or memos. Meanwhile, in a rented workspace across town, Jarius Rohn was reviewing risk vectors for a multinational nonprofit targeted by advanced persistent threats. His reports were sharp, clear, and evidence-backed. He had earned their trust within weeks, and his name had begun appearing in executive summaries as a recommended long-term partner. He never mentioned Sterling Glass. He didn't have to. The name had become shorthand in his journal for all things engineered to exclude. He added a new entry that night, detailing the forum mishap. He wrote about the missing name tag, the unspoken slight, and the photographer who skipped his row. He wrote about the quiet nod from Camille Dorsey, the only genuine gesture of recognition. He wrote it all. 2 floors down from Chamberlain's office, Bethany Crane was staring at an empty page in her notebook. She had received an anonymous interoffice envelope earlier that morning. Inside was a sticky note that read, "Look under the 3rd table in conference room 2. Read what they erased." There was nothing else in the envelope. No name. No return address. She knew what it meant. Bethany waited until lunch break, walked down to the conference room, and knelt beneath the 3rd table. The paper was gone, but she didn't need to see it to understand. She remembered Jarius Rohn. She remembered his resume. She remembered the way Chamberlain mocked his name, and now she knew the depth of the disregard. That night, she opened her private journal and made a note, I used to think silence kept me safe. Now I think it keeps me complicit. The next day, Raymond Darnell received a flagged memo in the internal system. It had been routed incorrectly, but was sent to him due to a clerical miscode in departmental prefixes. The memo contained a staff policy update draft labeled Interview Screening Enhancements. It included language about preferred tones of professional attire, visual alignment with executive aesthetics, and proactive culture matching. He recognized the language. He had seen it evolve from the visual standards memo weeks prior. Now it was being shaped into something more permanent, more codified. Raymond printed the draft highlighted phrases and slipped the pages into a file marked patterns. He didn't plan to act yet, but he was watching. Meanwhile, Chamberlain continued his private jokes. During a Friday mixer, he made another quip to his circle of loyalists. I don't care how many medals you pin to your chest. If you can't dress like you belong in our room, you don't. No one disagreed. No one pushed back. The laughter was quieter this time. Not out of shame, but calculation. Chamberlain was still powerful, but cracks had begun forming behind his walls. Men and women passed security checkpoints with coded badges, polished elevators hummed in rhythm, and whiteboards were filled with diagrams and acronyms. But beneath the structured buzz, something unseen had begun to shift. The past weeks had tightened something in the air. For Chamberlain Knox, the mood was mildly irritating. Emails lingered unanswered longer than usual, hallway chatter turned oddly careful, and Lucinda Park, usually quick with compliance updates, had grown evasive. He dismissed it as a seasonal lull, as employee fatigue, as anything but a sign of decay. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the house he'd built with charm, intimidation, and smoke had been quietly marked for inspection by forces far beyond his reach. Across the city, deep inside a nondescript federal building marked only by its 4-digit street number, Jarius Rohn stood beneath cold lighting in a secure meeting room, watching his case file projected across a wall. The file was thick, thicker than most. Every entry was cataloged, time-stamped, and verified. He had begun assembling it not out of vengeance, but necessity. What had started as a private journal had become a record of misconduct, a documentation of subtle violence veiled in etiquette. Each incident had a name, a face, a paper trail. From the freight hallway to the sticky note, from the panel erasure to the repurposed resume beneath the table leg. He had kept everything. He had recorded conversations, captured forwarded emails, collected passive-aggressive memos. He had even transcribed jokes heard secondhand, attaching names, times, tones. When the right people reached out to him, quietly, discreetly, he didn't hesitate. He knew that change, real change, didn't come from inside buildings like Sterling Glass. It came from those who refused to play by their rules. The federal task force working under the Office of Corporate Accountability had spent months mapping inequity patterns inside public-private contract firms. Sterling Glass had risen to the top of their list after 3 separate contractors flagged it for discriminatory recruiting trends. But what they lacked was something more intimate, more precise. Jarius provided that. He didn't come forward with anger. He came forward with structure. He came forward as a systems architect, a strategist who knew exactly how these institutions wrapped their prejudice in policy. The summit he was attending was invitation only, senior auditors, legal counsel, ethics compliance heads. One of them, a woman named Andrea Webb, a Harvard Law graduate with a background in regulatory litigation, had read his file front to back 3 times. This, she'd said, tapping the cover, is not just testimony. It's a mirror. Jarius stood as they walked through the timeline, each screen shifting from resume submission to hallway redirection, from recorded remarks to image policy memos. Every point was marked with evidence, emails, security logs, printouts, photographs. Andrea gestured toward the wall. You've created an end-to-end life cycle of discrimination disguised as formality. Every step engineered to fail while looking like a meritocracy. He nodded. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a truth laid bare. The room held its breath when the final slide appeared. An audit initiation form bearing the Sterling Glass name. The watermark glowed faintly, and the signatures of 3 federal agencies flanked the bottom. The audit was scheduled, though not yet disclosed. It would be silent at first, requests for hiring data, background check logs, applicant traffic flow analysis. But it would grow. And eventually, it would reach the top floor. Jarius didn't smile. He didn't need to. His work wasn't personal. It was precise. Back inside Sterling Glass, Bethany Crane noticed something unusual in the calendar feed. A flagged appointment set by the Department of Labor, marked confidential. She forwarded it to Lucinda, who deleted the notice without comment. Chamberlain, oblivious, continued planning an upcoming investment summit. At one point during his prep meeting, he turned to Raymond Darnell and asked whether any recent community hires had tried to reapply. Raymond blinked once, shook his head slowly, and said nothing. He had seen the memo weeks earlier. He had seen the returned resume. And now he was watching the quiet breath before collapse. In the back of his desk drawer, Raymond had a copy of the report Jarius had submitted to the civic engineering firm. He had recognized the name, the formatting, even the phrasing. And he had connected the dots. Something larger was moving. Something that wouldn't be stopped with charm or a clean press photo. Jarius left the summit building with a flash drive in his pocket and a letter in his briefcase. The letter was not for publication, not for retaliation. It was a confirmation of collaboration. It granted him protected contributor status, shielding his name and identity until the investigation reached public disclosure. But even with protection, he knew he was visible. He had walked through the front door of that firm multiple times. He had been seen. He had been laughed at. There were no illusions. If they found out he was the one triggering the walls to crack, they would strike. But he wasn't afraid. The truth wasn't a weapon. It was armor. He returned to his apartment that night and updated his journal. He wrote, "The walls have names now." He added a second entry underneath it, "I was never invisible." They just couldn't see past their own reflection. Across the table, his laptop blinked with an incoming message. Another consulting firm requesting availability for a system audit. His reputation was growing, not in press headlines or Twitter threads, but in private circles that mattered, where truth traveled without filters, and where credibility was built not through access, but through action. The next morning at Sterling Glass, Chamberlain received a strange call. A representative from a partnering firm had questions about a compliance review and asked whether their applicant data from 2023 could be shared for joint vetting. The call was routine on the surface, but the tone was careful. Chamberlain waved it off to legal. He still didn't see it, still believed the silence meant control. He didn't know that the silence was already turning into signal. What seemed like routine document requests, polite, formal, unthreatening, slowly shifted into patterns that could no longer be explained away. Inside the HR department, Lucinda Park received a second data request within a week. This time it was specific: resume retention logs, automated rejection filters, and a complete list of candidate disqualifications with supporting documentation. The deadline was 48 hours. She read the request 3 times before printing it and locking her office door. On the surface, the data looked clean. Sterling Glass had always excelled at appearances. But as she began combing through the logs, something began to unravel. Several names flagged in the system showed inconsistencies, resumes marked as viewed but never interviewed, applicants with credentials flagged as exceptional by AI screening but later dismissed without notation. When Lucinda followed the digital trail further, she found gaps, recordings of interviews that were missing, feedback forms with identical phrasing, and denial letters generated before applications had even been fully opened. One column in particular stood out: name anomaly match. It had been a placeholder in the original system build, meant to highlight candidates with unusual formatting in names for follow-up. But someone had recoded its function to quietly flag names that didn't fit a predetermined mold. Jarius Roan's name was among them. Lucinda leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen. She felt the floor shift under her, not physically, but morally. It wasn't the first time she had ignored a question, shredded a file, or chosen survival over resistance. But this was the first time the shadows were folding inward. Outside her office, The rest of the floor moved as if nothing had changed. Analysts prepared reports. Administrative assistants answered phones. Chamberlain Knox stood in his usual morning meeting, talking about quarterly optics and growth. But inside that HR database, the system was bleeding. She didn't know yet that Bethany Crane had found a copy of the same report, flagged in a cross-departmental compliance feed she had access to as part of the executive project office. Bethany had read every line and recognized more than one name, but one in particular stood out. Not because it was strange, but because she had once seen it on the top of a resume. She remembered the gold-trimmed paper, the hand-delivered envelope, the way Chamberlain laughed as he folded it in half. Jarius Rohn. It had been months, but the name had never left her mind. And now, reading the metadata of the internal audit, she saw the truth for the first time. Jarius hadn't vanished. He had become the tide beneath their feet. Later that day, she called a meeting in a reserved conference room. It was quiet, discreet, scheduled under a generic title. Only 3 people were invited: Raymond Darnell, Lucinda Park, and Bethany herself. They sat with the blinds closed, the door locked, and a printed packet between them. Bethany began without hesitation. "I know who the whistleblower is," she said. Raymond blinked. Lucinda froze. "It's Jarius Rohn," she continued. "He was the one we redirected to the service hallway. The one you never re-entered into the scheduling queue." Lucinda didn't speak immediately. Raymond looked between them. "How do you know?" he asked. Bethany slid the audit overview forward. "He built the timeline. His notes match our internal system. He had access to everything: feedback templates, room logs, response times. This wasn't guesswork. He documented the architecture of our discrimination and handed it to the government." Lucinda's face turned pale. She reached slowly for the packet and leafed through it, her hand trembling slightly. "His resume," she said at last. "It was under a table. Someone brought it to me." Raymond's voice dropped. "What did you do with it?" Lucinda looked up, her eyes wet but sharp. "I shredded it. I was told not to escalate. I thought," she trailed off. Bethany's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. You thought it would protect us. You thought if we erased the symbol, we erased the damage." Raymond leaned forward. "Does Chamberlain know?" Bethany shook her head. "Not yet. But the audit teams will be interviewing directors next. It's only a matter of time." Outside the room, the day moved on. Chamberlain posed for a press photo near the building's main sculpture, speaking about innovation and inclusion with a marketing director who had no idea she was being quoted for a cover story on corporate vision. He smiled, shook hands, and approved a newsletter with the title, "Forward Together." He did not know that several federal investigators were already seated in nearby buildings, reviewing his hiring matrices. He did not know that internal emails flagged with keyword patterns were being analyzed for biased language and discriminatory inference. He did not know that his own voice had been transcribed from meeting recordings forwarded by more than one employee. But most of all, he did not know that the man he had mocked, erased, and joked about, the man with the resume he turned into a coffee coaster, had built a file now threatening to bring his empire to its knees. Back in the conference room, the silence after the revelation felt different than fear. It was heavy with reckoning. Raymond sat back, arms crossed. "So what now?" he asked. Bethany looked at Lucinda. "We stop pretending we don't know. We prepare for the fallout." Lucinda swallowed hard. He was kind. He never raised his voice. He never made demands. Raymond nodded, and we treated him like background noise. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Bethany gathered the packet and stood. "We have a choice. We can wait for the storm, or we can start telling the truth before it hits." She left the room first. Raymond followed. Lucinda stayed behind, her hand still resting on the shredded paper confirmation notice she'd kept as a backup. She slid it into her drawer and locked it. That evening, Jarius received an encrypted message confirming the audit's second phase had begun. It included an anonymized summary of internal reactions, noting that several mid-level managers had acknowledged systemic irregularities. The message didn't name names, but Jarius understood the implication. Cracks were forming. Truth, once buried, was surfacing. Within minutes, media outlets picked it up. Financial analysts began issuing warnings, and internal Slack channels filled with nervous speculation. On the 34th floor of Sterling Glass Tower, the executive suite remained eerily quiet as news anchors dissected the story on muted television screens. Chamberlain Knox arrived 10 minutes late to his own leadership meeting, flanked by his usual arrogance and unaware that his company's foundation was already crumbling beneath him. He took a seat, opened his laptop, and found 37 emails marked urgent. By the time he read the subject line of the first, investor withdrawal notice, his phone began vibrating nonstop. In the next 24 hours, two of the company's largest institutional backers pulled funding from a pending infrastructure initiative. For others issued statements about reassessing their relationship with Sterling Glass pending the outcome of the investigation. Shares began to slip. At first it was subtle, half a point, then 2. By the second day, it was down nearly 12%. The legal department worked around the clock to prepare a response, but no one could stop what had already begun. The audit had teeth. Emails were being traced. Conversations were being transcribed. And within those documents lived Chamberlain's voice, his jokes, his directives, his silent nods of approval when others did his bidding. His private arrogance had become public evidence. On the ground floor, Bethany Crane watched the news scroll across her phone. She didn't look away. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not for justice as spectacle, but for the quiet righting of something broken. She sent a message to Raymond. "It's happening." He replied a minute later. "He deserves every second of it." Lucinda Park sat alone in her office, reviewing the final email she had submitted to the audit team. In it, she detailed the shredding of Jarius's resume, the pressure to remain silent, and the internal policies she now recognized as tools of exclusion. She knew her name would be attached to the timeline. She had no illusions about escaping blame, but she also knew she wasn't going to lie anymore. When the ethics inquiry team asked her for a statement, she didn't request anonymity. She spoke plainly, listing the dates, the directives, and her role in executing them. When asked why she was coming forward now, she said, "Because I should have done it then." As the audit findings became public, media coverage intensified. News clips replayed soundbites of executives praising diversity while burying evidence of discrimination. Chamberlain Knox's image, once the face of tech sector brilliance, appeared beside headlines describing systemic injustice and corporate malpractice. Journalists uncovered audio leaks, forwarded by anonymous employees, of Chamberlain mocking names during interview review sessions, drawing racial caricatures with his tone, and describing certain applicants as culturally unfit for the firm's vision. When pressed for comment, his spokesperson issued a generic denial, but the damage was irreversible. Pressure from the board intensified. Several directors called for an emergency session. A whistleblower from the marketing team released internal communications showing that the company's diversity campaigns were largely fabricated, with staged photographs and false testimonials. One in turn provided an email in which Chamberlain asked legal to clean up candidate databases before a previous investor audit. Inside a closed-door boardroom, the decision was swift. The board voted unanimously to terminate Chamberlain's contract, citing gross misconduct and ethical breach. An hour later, security escorted him from his office. His exit was silent. There were no handshakes, no farewell speech, just the weight of consequence following behind him like a shadow. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't turn back. Jarius Rohn watched the coverage unfold from his apartment. He didn't cheer. He didn't post a statement. He simply updated his journal with a single line. The wall finally cracked. The record stands. Calls began coming in from other firms, public institutions, and legal groups requesting consultation, insight, and guidance on building better systems. He chose his engagements carefully, declining anything that felt performative. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in repair. Across the company, former silence gave way to courage. Employees who had once stayed quiet began sharing their own stories. A project manager admitted being passed over for promotion after refusing to implement optics-based review sorting. A junior recruiter described how directives came from above to slow-roll certain candidates through the pipeline. One former applicant wrote a letter describing how she was invited for a second interview, only to arrive and be mistaken for a catering staff member. The stories all followed the same pattern: dismissal disguised as professionalism, bias hidden beneath decorum. The Department of Labor released its preliminary findings in a redacted report. Sterling Glass had systematically manipulated hiring filters to exclude candidates based on name, attire, perceived cultural affiliations, and nonverbal factors unrelated to performance. The company's internal training documents were described as performative and ineffective. Public trust collapsed. Clients canceled contracts. Analysts downgraded the company's forecast from stable to negative. Raymond walked past Chamberlain's empty office the day after his termination. He paused at the threshold, looking at the sterile desk and empty bookshelf. It felt strangely hollow. Not satisfying, not triumphant, just hollow. He turned away without stepping inside. Bethany joined him in the hallway. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Upstairs, the interim CEO released a public statement acknowledging the company's failure, accepting full responsibility for the harm caused, and promising transparency. But no words could undo what had been done. Trust, once broken, did not return easily. In the days that followed, Jarius received a letter. It was unsigned but postmarked from within the Sterling Glass Tower. Inside was a folded piece of the same parchment paper he had used for his resume. On it was written, "You were always overqualified for this place." He placed it in the back of his journal, between the earliest entries and the last. He didn't know who had sent it. He didn't need to. It was a small recognition in a sea of omission. The city wore a different face now, quieter and less polished, still humming with commerce and ambition, but bearing the invisible scars of exposure. Sterling Glass had not collapsed entirely, but it had been hollowed out, restructured under new leadership, and forced into public compliance with transparency reforms. A trust fund had been established for applicants wrongfully denied during the discriminatory hiring period, and a commission of independent monitors now oversaw every major personnel decision. Stock value had stabilized, though it hovered far below its former height, and reputation, once prized above all, had become a fragile, rebuilding thing. Jarius Rohn's name had become known among those who mattered, not in celebrity circles or social feeds, but in academic panels, government roundtables, and underground networks, where real change was plotted. Yet despite the recognition, he never allowed his life to orbit around that one victory. He continued his work, balancing contracts with volunteer hours at a community tech center in the industrial district, where low-income youth learned cybersecurity from veterans, engineers, and analysts like himself. The center was not glamorous. The ceiling tiles occasionally leaked, the chairs were mismatched, and the computers were secondhand. But the energy was real. The students came hungry to learn, many of them first generation, many of them still shaking off the weight of being underestimated. Jarius arrived twice a week without fanfare. He taught quietly, thoroughly, and without pretense. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated. He didn't boast. He built. To those who asked about his past, he said only that he had seen enough broken systems to know they needed rebuilding from the ground up. It was on a gray Wednesday that the man entered, older than the others, hunched slightly from the shoulders, eyes cast low, wearing a second-hand coat 2 sizes too big. He didn't speak to anyone at first, simply stood in the back of the room, pretending to review a flyer about digital literacy. One of the volunteers offered him a seat. He declined. The next session, he returned, again silent, again observing. By the third visit, he asked quietly if he could sit near the beginners. No one recognized him, at least not immediately. His name on the sign-in sheet was abbreviated, and his posture betrayed no arrogance, only fatigue. But Jarius noticed. He saw through the slouched shoulders, the poorly shaved jawline, the way the man's fingers twitched when a student mentioned company ethics. Chamberlain Knox had once commanded rooms full of executives. Now he sat silently beside teenagers, learning how to protect passwords and configure firewalls. At first, Jarius said nothing. He didn't react. He continued the lesson as usual. But that night, he stayed late, filing reports, tidying equipment. And Chamberlain remained, standing in the doorway like a shadow refusing to vanish. Eventually, he stepped inside. There was no anger in Jarius's face, no triumph, just calm acknowledgement. Chamberlain cleared his throat but couldn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice cracked. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He said he didn't know where else to go. He said that no firm would hire him, that his name had become radioactive, that he'd sold his car and sublet his apartment and still couldn't find footing. He said he hadn't come for pity or redemption. He had come because he watched Jarius teach with patience and clarity and no resentment in his voice. He had come because he needed to see what real purpose looked like after everything hollow had been burned away. Jarius listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He waited until Chamberlain had finished. Then he said one sentence: "You start by showing up when it's hard, not when it's safe." Chamberlain nodded slowly. He asked if he could help clean the keyboards. Jarius handed him a disinfectant wipe and pointed to the workbench. That night, they worked in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that separates. It was the kind that holds weight between two people who understand that what is broken cannot always be restored, but it can be rebuilt. In the months that followed, Chamberlain continued to show up. He never used his full name. He never tried to take credit. He swept floors, carried chairs, fixed old monitors, and sat through beginner lessons without complaint. He never once asked to lead. He followed. He listened. He watched. Slowly, the other volunteers accepted him as a fixture. Odd, quiet, but dependable. The students didn't know who he was, and he didn't tell them. He wasn't hiding. He was learning. He began reading about restorative justice, about policy reform, about unconscious bias. He started attending open forums, hosted by grassroots organizers, and sat in the back, always taking notes. He didn't speak. He didn't post. He didn't preach. Jarius observed all this without comment. He didn't vouch for him. He didn't warn others. He simply let the man exist within the space of his own choices. And when one day a student asked who the quiet old guy with the scarred hands was, Jarius replied, "Just someone learning how to show up." Eventually, Chamberlain drafted a letter, not to Jarius, but to the board of Sterling Glass, accepting full responsibility for his role in the systemic discrimination uncovered during the audit. He included specific dates, directives, and admitted to falsifying candidate evaluations. He didn't ask for reinstatement. He didn't attach a resume. He asked only that the company use his severance, which he had never touched, to fund scholarships for underrepresented youth in tech. He sent the letter and never followed up. Months later, the company announced a new grant program bearing no names, but Jarius knew. He recognized the language. He recognized the quiet. The community center continued to grow. More volunteers arrived. More students signed up. One day, a mural appeared on the back wall, painted by one of the students, depicting a cracked building being rebuilt from the inside, with hands of all shades working together. Beneath it, in simple letters, were the words, "Build better, quietly." Jarius stood beneath the mural one evening, watching a new group of students arrive. He felt the weight of years behind him, not as burden, but as foundation. He remembered the freight hallway, the sticky note, the laughter. He remembered the silence, the mockery, the dismissal. But he also remembered the tide. He remembered that the wall cracked, and that the truth, when spoken fully and lived consistently, didn't need a spotlight to matter. It mattered because it changed things. Across the city, across offices and classrooms and conversations, the name Jarius Rohn became less a headline and more a compass. Not for vengeance, not for recognition, but for integrity. He had never set out to destroy. He had set out to reveal. And in that revelation, he had opened a space where even those who once harmed could choose to be more than their worst moments. The end. If you're still here after the full story, thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot, the twists, and the final redemption? Did any part of the story resonate with you personally? Let me know where you're watching from and how you felt about the ending in the comments. Your feedback helps shape what comes next. If you appreciated the storytelling, consider supporting with a like and subscribing so you don't miss future stories like this, grounded, intense, and full of meaning. More is on the way.